Hi, this is Mahesh Ravi, and in this video, we'll be taking a look at the material options in Cinema 4D. So this is going to be the part one of the series where I will try my level best to introduce you to the materials, how to tweak materials, how to create proper textures using Cinema 4D. So we are in Cinema 4D. Now, the techniques that we will be discussing today is applicable to pretty much every 3D software that you know, Blender, Cinema 4D, 3D Studio Max, Maya. The way that the algorithm works is similar, but the interface that you will be using is going to be slightly different. There are going to be slate material editors, there are going to be node-based material editors, there are parameter controls. We will be using the default material editor in Cinema 4D to understand what this basically means. What is texturing and what is the difference between basic materials and textures, right? So we'll get started. So before we talk about textures, let me build a very basic scene. So I'm going to start by making a floor and also by making a sphere, right? So this is going to be our dummy materials that we'll be using while we start with materials. So right now you can see that the sphere is pretty basic and it doesn't have much segments. So I'm going to increase my segments to 60 so that we can see a clear view of our materials, right? So we have these objects in our scene and it doesn't have any materials assigned to it, right? So if you take a quick render, you can see pretty much nothing because it doesn't have any depth or shadows or colors or textures or nothing in it. It's very basic scene. Now we are going to play around with this. So before that, let me start by creating a light so that we can start to see our material slightly better. So I'm going to go to this, and for this particular example, I'm going to use a physical sky. So we have a physical sky right here. And if you render it right now, we can start to see some details here. So we can see a shadow and all that stuff. This is good enough for the time being. Now, the most important thing, or the most important panel that we will be using is the material panel, which is right here. It's situated at the bottom of your Cinema 4D page. This is where you actually create a material, you import a material, and you edit your materials, right? So we are going to create a new material. Let's go to create and create a new material. So now you can see a thumbnail appear on your material panel, and you can see that opened in your properties panel as well. If you double click on this, it will open up in a floating window. And this is what we are going to do. Now to apply this to the sphere, you can just drag this from this thumbnail to the object, and you can immediately see that the material is applied onto the object, right? So now let's see what are the parameters here. You can see a lot of parameters that you can play around with. We will be trying to understand each one of this. So it will be slightly difficult and it will be confusing if I explain everything at one go. So we'll make it into, I thought of making this as a series where I will be talking about a few techniques in one video and the other techniques in the follow-up. So what we're going to do here, let's see what are the options which are ticked in here. So there is color and reflectance. These are checked right now. So let's see the options inside color. So whatever parameter that you're selecting, on your right side you can see the advanced options of that particular option. So let's go with color. This is the most basic setting. This is where you decide what is the actual hue of your object. So if you turn this off, for example, if I'm turning the color off, there is zero color in it, but because there is reflectance property to this material, light is actually hitting and some amount of light is bouncing off of this. So that is the reflection that we are seeing. So if you turn off the reflection also, this is going to be pitch black. There is no data at all. So we're going to turn on the color, right? Let's play around with the color first. I'm going to come here and we can see the hue, saturation and value. Let's say the saturation to red. So we have a red material in here, a red object, right? Let's turn on the reflectance. And we have a reflection also here. So now light is bounced from this red object. So we have the color, which we just turned it to red, and we also have the reflectance turned on. Let's take a quick render and see how our object is looking, right? So it is red and you can see the reflection in here, right? So that's good. Now, I'm going to talk about the reflectance a little more. We cannot see much. What is the reflection which is happening? We can just see, sort of a gradient or a light bounce which is happening here. But how will you know that this is really reflective, right? So let's create a duplicate object. So I'm going to just select the sphere and just Control C and Control V to create another sphere. We can move it slightly to the side. We'll create one more copy, Control V, Control C, and paste it somewhere here, position it somewhere here. So we have 3 objects in our scene right now, but all of them are sharing the same material. You can see that in the material slot right next to these objects. We'll try and change these values, right? But before that, let's go in to the material. Let's play around with the reflectance. So right now, we can see that there is a reflection object in here. So if you render it right now, this is what we are going to see. There is not much of reflection happening. There is nothing interesting happening in here, right? So we are going to start this panel from start. So you can see that by default, they have added a default specular, right? Let's remove it. So it's going to go. Right now, there is no reflection data here. We are going to add something new, right? Let's try adding a Beckman reflection model. There are so many models in here. We will try a few more, but let's try the Beckman, the first one. So we're going to try it. Immediately, you can see that this is a highly reflective material right now. Let's take a quick render and see how this is coming. All right, this is very reflective right now. You can start to see the other spheres through it, right? So the reflection is working, but this is slightly too much, right? This is like a glass or maybe highly reflective material. This is not what we exactly want, right? So if you come down to the options here, there are different settings here. There is the first one is the layer opacity. You can reduce the layer opacity. So see what is happening when you reduce the layer opacity, right? You can start to see something. Let's take a render. We can see the color also in here, but there is a better way to do that. Let's bring it all the way up, right? We are going down and we can see the type is Beckman. This is the reflection material that we have chosen. And there is an attenuation here. So change this to additive. You might have used it in Photoshop. We are changing the reflection to additive. So it's like blending mode in, so it is the reflection material parameters that we just applied is added as an additive layer on top of the red color, right? So we have the additive in here. There is a reflection strength in here. So let's reduce the reflection strength. We don't want it to be very reflective. We can do that. Now let's take a render and see how this is looking. Okay, this is slightly better, right? It's looking slightly good. Now we can still do some more adjustments, right? We can make it even more less reflective. So we are making the reflection really, really less, 9%. Let's render it and see. Now it's looking kind of realistic, right? But the surface is very, very flat, which means that this is highly reflective. The reflections are very sharp. So here is what you can do here. If you increase the roughness, if you notice the thumbnail, you can see the surface is getting a slight bit of noise and saying that it's not very reflective. Even though it is reflective, there is a little bit of texture on the surface. So this is the basic difference between material and texture. Like material is the color value of an object, and texture is how it feels. What sort of surface the object is going to have, right? Is it rough? Is it pointy? Is it dented? Is it damaged? All those things, right? So I'm increasing the roughness here, and let's take a quick look at the render. Now we can see the reflection is happening. You can still see it, but it's not as reflective as the previous, render, because we have increased the roughness. The reflection is slightly distorted. So there is some sort of roughness on the texture, and that's the reason the reflection is getting blurred. So these are some of the options that you can do here. Now we will be talking about reflections, more advanced reflections later, but let's talk about color a little more in this video. So if you go to color, right? If you're going into color, we actually changed the saturation value in here and changed the spheres into a red color in here, right? We can also upload an image into it and say that that is the texture I want to use in here. So you can open here and you go to the image, open it, and it's going to ask that Cinema 4D doesn't have this data stored on its path. Do you want to save a copy? I'll say no. And we can immediately see that the texture or the image that you just loaded is applied in here. Now let's close this for a second and take a look at this. So the spheres right now have this texture in here. When you click on this slot, you can see a set of properties popping up in the properties panel down here, right? So it is going to show the material name, the projection that it's using. So there are several projections in here. You can change it to spherical, you can change it to cylindrical. So you can see all of this, how it is affecting, right? So how this particular material is applied or wrapped into the model. So let's go with UVW wrapping itself. That's working pretty fine, right? You can change the tile value also, so that if the stretch is too much, you can do this. So if you change the tiling to 2, it's actually changing here. See, we didn't change the tile value of these two textures, but we increase this a little bit, so it is looking a little more sharper, right? We can do that here also for all the materials. Let's do the tiling of 2. Okay, 2 and 2. So we have it like this. So this is how you load up a material into Cinema 4D. Now let's take a look at slightly more map-based parameters in material editing. So I'm going to reset the scene. Let's open up a new scene. We'll build another scene. Let's create a floor, and this time let's create a cube. So we have a cube in here. We have a basic cube. Let's create 2 very normal lights, right? So we have one light. It's a basic light in here. Keep that in here. And let's add a shadow parameter. So in here, let's duplicate this light. So Control C and Control V will duplicate the light, and you can move it in another direction. So I'm going to keep it somewhere in here. I will reduce the, I'll remove the shadow, and I will reduce the intensity of the light a little bit. So we have this. Let's take a quick render and see how this is looking, right? So we have this right now, which is okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new material. Same way, we're going to create a material, open this up. We'll turn off the reflectance right now. We just need the color value in here, but instead of color, we are going to add an image for this. So let's go to texture, load image, and let's load this image in here. So I'm going to open, no, and drag it, and it's going to apply this right here. So this is now looking like a brick wall or a pillar, right? Take a quick render, and it's looking like this. Now, the problem is that it's looking too flat, right? If you look at the textures right here, it's looking too flat. This is not the way that an actual brick wall is going to look like. There are going to be perforations, there are going to be dents, there are going to be sort of bumps, right? All of this will be there. So this is where all of this parameters will be used. So today we are going to talk about a couple of parameters in here. So we will be using maps for displacement, bump, and also for normal in here. So let's create these maps. How do we create these maps? So there is an easy way to create these maps. I'm going to go to this website. I will leave the link down in the description. So I'm going to go to normal map, and normal map is something where sort of like a bump map, right? You are defining the surface of that object, right, the material, based on its contrast values, blacks and whites, right? You're going to create that. So to create a normal map, let's go to normal map online tool. So I'm going to click on the first slot. I'm going to choose the texture that we just used, right? So it's immediately going to load up, and it is going to show the result in here, the original source image, and also the maps. So we can see there is a normal map, there is a displacement map, there is something called ambient occlusion, and there is something called specular. We will need all these stuff, so we will go here, and if there is any tweaking that you need to do, we can do it here. We can increase the contrast of the displacement if you want. For normal map, you can reduce the strength if you don't want that much of strength in it. So once you're done with all of this, right, we can download all of it. So I'm going to download this and click save. So every map is going to be saved into your computer. So now that we have all the maps, we have generated all the maps that we require to texture this material properly. So now let's open up our material slot. We will add the normal map first. So let's go to normal map, make sure that this is checked, right? So now color and normal map is checked. Let's go to texture, open this, load image, and take the normal map that we just downloaded. Open, no, and you can immediately see that there is some sort of, surface data added to it, based on the contrast and all that, based on the blacks and whites. So it is adding that depth data into this. So let's take a quick render and see what is the difference that we are seeing. We can see instead of the smooth surface that we previously had, this is kind of having a realistic feel to the bricks. So if this is too much, in case if this is too much, you can always go back here and reduce the settings a bit. So I'm going to reduce this a slight bit, right, to 80%. I'm going to bring it down to 80%. So we have our normal map sort of set. Let's go into the displacement map right now. So click on the displacement map, load our displacement map from the texture, open it up. No. And when you add the displacement map, you can see that it is taking some sort of effect in the thumbnail, but we cannot see anything in the preview because this displacement map will only affect the render view, right? You cannot see that while you're working. So you can see this. Let's take a render and see if you can see any difference in here. Not much of difference, right? That is because it is not affecting the sub polygons of this model, right? It's only affecting the surface of it. So what we are going to do right now is we are going to come to displacement and turn on sub polygon displacement. We've done that. Now if you render it, you can start to see some sort of aberrations in here, right? So you can see the edges. This is looking slightly realistic, more realistic. So if you don't need this much of strength, you can bring it down here again. So we can make it to maybe 70%, render it, it is looking slightly okayish, right? We can bring it down again. So maybe 20%, click OK. I think this is fine. This is fine for the map that we are using. You can also add a bump map, but since we have a normal map, we don't actually require bump. Normal map is a slightly more advanced version of the normal bump map, right? Both of it creates a surface that will interact with your 3D lighting, right? So since we already have a normal map, we are not going to use bump map. So if you don't know how to create a normal map or you don't have a normal map, you can always use the displacement version or the black and white version of this image into the bump map and raise up the value to create a similar effect, but it's not going to be as good as this, right? So we have done this. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we will try and bring the reflectance back into this object. So let's come in here. Now if you look here in specular, default specular is here. So what we can do here is we can always come to texture, open this up, load image, and we can load our specular map right into that channel. So our thumbnail, our reflections are based on the same image, so it is going to look slightly more realistic. So wherever there is darkness, there will be less reflection bounced off it. Wherever the light is hitting, that particular area will bounce off more light, more stronger, based on the texture of the surface, which is a more realistic way of reactions, right? So we have it right now. We have all this added. So we can play around with the strength and we will get a realistic render of it. So if you take the light, right, if you move it around, you can see how this actually affects the object, right? If you look at the material, it looks like it is not just a flat image, it is actually affecting the light also appears like that. So when I'm moving the light into it, if you can notice here, you can start to see all those damages, all those dents on the brick more clearly. That is because we have used a normal map, right? So if you render this out right now, you can start to see that where there is not much light, it's giving more details in here, right? So I hope you had an understanding of how to play with these parameters. So in this video, we spoke about basic materials, how to change colors, how to add texture, how to play with normal maps, displacement map, and specular maps, right? We also spoke about reflectance. So in the upcoming video about materials, we'll be talking much in depth about how to create realistic materials with multiple layers on them. So I hope you have enjoyed it and this was easy to follow. Try it out and I'll see you soon with the second video in the series. Till then, take care. Bye.